Hello and welcome to Silent Echo. There are cases that begin with a body on the ground, a broken lock, a final scream, a witness who sees too much and cannot forget it. Then there are the cases that begin with something quieter and in some ways far worse. Music from an upper deck bar, warm Caribbean air, a family cruise that should have become a happy memory, a young woman asleep on a balcony chair. Then daylight, then confusion, then a ship full of strangers moving toward shore while one passenger is already gone. Amy Lynn Bradley was 23 years old when she disappeared from a Royal Caribbean cruise ship in March of 1998. She was traveling with her parents and her brother aboard the Rhapsody of the Seas on a Caribbean vacation. By sunrise on the morning of March 24th, somewhere near Curaçao, Amy was no longer in the family cabin. She was not in the hall, not at breakfast, not on deck in any obvious place. And from that moment on, her story split into two different worlds. In one world, the simplest explanation took hold almost immediately. Amy had gone overboard, she had fallen, she had jumped. She had somehow gone into the water in darkness or dawn and disappeared into the sea before anyone understood what had happened. That theory had the power of brutal common sense. A ship, an open balcony, alcohol the night before, the ocean below. It was clean, fast, final. In the other world, the case refused to stay that simple, because people kept reporting that they had seen her. On Curaçao, on a beach, in a brothel, in photographs from years later, because the timeline on the ship was narrow but not clean, because some details pointed toward vulnerability and accident, while others suggested that if Amy left that cabin alive, she may not have left it alone, because her family did not believe the sea had taken her, and because more than 2 decades later, there is still no body, no verified final moment, and no answer that closes the door. This is the kind of disappearance that survives because it never gives only one kind of fear. It contains the fear of falling unseen into open water, the fear of being trapped in a crowded place and not being protected by the crowd, the fear of a ship continuing forward because institutions do what institutions do best, they keep moving. And maybe worst of all, the fear of being close to land, close to people, close to rescue, and still somehow unreachable. Amy Bradley did not vanish in wilderness. She did not disappear alone on an empty road. She vanished in one of the strangest locations a person can vanish from. A cruise ship full of passengers, staff, lights, schedules, cameras, hallways, music, announcements, and doors. A floating city designed to make its guests feel that nothing serious can happen because everything is managed for them. The ship is supposed to be structure. It is supposed to be procedure. It is supposed to remove uncertainty, and yet this case begins with one of the most unsettling contradictions in modern disappearance history. A woman was on board. Then she was not. No one can say exactly how that happened. No one can say exactly when. And every explanation leaves something behind that it cannot quite account for. To understand why the Amy Bradley case still grips people, you have to resist the urge to jump straight to the most dramatic theory. That is the temptation with this story. A cruise ship feels cinematic by default. The sea does too. Add late-night music, an unfamiliar island, alleged sightings, a possible predator, and years of rumor, and the whole thing begins to resemble a thriller. But the real power of the case comes from something else. It comes from how ordinary the last normal hours seem. It comes from the fact that Amy did not step into obvious danger. She stepped into a vacation, into family time, into a floating environment built on the promise that every detail had been considered. And somewhere inside that promise, something broke. Amy was from Virginia. She was athletic, social, and by many accounts comfortable in the water. That detail matters because it shaped how people later thought about the possibility of an accident. She was not someone unfamiliar with the sea. She had worked as a lifeguard. She had the kind of confidence around water that can make a person seem even less likely to vanish in it. But that same fact can cut in two directions. Competence does not cancel risk. Sometimes it only makes the final gap harder for others to believe. People hear that someone was a strong swimmer or a lifeguard and imagine that the ocean should have given them a chance. It gives no one. Her family did not board that ship expecting history. They boarded like so many families do, carrying all the small assumptions of an ordinary trip, that the memory would be made of beaches, photographs, food, jokes, and maybe the mild irritations that later become stories. That if someone had too much to drink, they would sleep it off. That if someone stepped away, they would be back in an hour. That a ship in the Caribbean was a place where people might get sunburned, tired, hungover, annoyed, maybe even lost for a few minutes, but not erased. The Rhapsody of the Seas had left San Juan and was moving through its itinerary toward Curaçao. By the night before Amy disappeared, the family was deep enough into the rhythm of cruise life that the ordinary rules of a floating schedule had taken over. Music, bars, elevators, shared balconies, decks above decks, the artificial freedom of a place where everything is available and nothing feels far away. On a ship, distances shrink psychologically. A lounge is only down a hall. A dance floor is one deck away. Your room is close enough to come and go from. People drift in and out of view constantly. This creates a strange kind of trust, not the trust of deep safety, but the trust of immediate return. If someone is gone for 10 minutes, they are probably around the corner. If they are gone for an hour, they are probably somewhere on the ship. On land, that can already be misleading. At sea, it can become fatal. Amy spent part of that final night with her brother Brad. They were out late, dancing and drinking around one of the ship's club areas. This part of the case has been repeated for years because it creates the last undeniably normal frame in the story. A young woman on vacation dancing with her brother and with people around the ship's nightlife scene. Music, drinks, heat, movement. Nothing in that image suggests that the case is already narrowing around her. Nothing in that image warns that, before breakfast, her name will no longer belong to a passenger, but to a missing persons file. One of the details that remained important in later retellings was Amy's contact with a member of the ship's band. His name appears in many discussions of the case because witnesses and the family placed him within Amy's orbit on that final night, and by some accounts, near the last window in which she may still have been seen alive on the ship. This matters, but it also has to be handled carefully. In cases like this, suspicion grows naturally around the last known social contact, especially if that person was not family and came from the half-anonymous world of cruise entertainment, where guests see staff repeatedly but know almost nothing about them. That does not make the suspicion baseless. It does mean the gap between unsettling circumstance and provable guilt has to be respected. By the time Amy and Brad returned to the family cabin, the night had already crossed into the early morning records from the cabin door system, later helped establish at least part of the timeline. Brad came back first. Amy followed shortly after. The two of them sat out on the balcony for a while, talking and cooling down after the club. This is one of the most haunting parts of the case because it feels so intimate and so harmless. A brother and sister talking above the dark sea while the ship moves toward shore. That is not a dangerous image. It is a human one. A tired conversation before sleep. The sort of moment a family later remembers with pain because it looked like nothing. At some point, Brad went to bed. Amy stayed out on the balcony. That much is generally consistent across the known timeline. Their father, Ron Bradley, woke later in the early morning and looked out toward the balcony. He would later say that he saw Amy there, lying on a lounge chair. He could see her legs. He believed she was still resting outside. He went back to sleep. When he woke again a short time later, she was gone. That single decision has haunted the family for decades. Not because it was unreasonable, it was perfectly reasonable. A father looked out, saw his daughter where he expected her to be, and went back to sleep. That is what normal life looks like. But in disappearance cases, ordinary decisions become permanent chambers of replay. What if he had stayed awake? What if he had stepped outside? What if he had spoken to her? What if he had noticed something off in the posture, the silence, the door, the air? Those questions are cruel because they ask people to retroactively become someone they had no reason to be. He was not negligent. He was living inside a world that still seemed intact. When the family realized Amy was no longer in the cabin, the first response appears to have been confusion rather than immediate catastrophe. That makes sense. A cruise ship is a place of false possibilities. She could have gone upstairs. She could have gone for coffee. She could have taken a walk. She could have met someone. She could have stepped out to smoke. She could have wandered toward a deck rail and simply lost track of time. The ship creates dozens of benign explanations before the dark one arrives. And that delay matters, because the Amy Bradley case is in part a story about how quickly critical time can be lost when an environment offers too many normal reasons for temporary absence. By around 6 in the morning, the family was searching for her in earnest. Amy's cigarettes and lighter were reportedly missing, which suggested she may have stepped away deliberately rather than being taken directly from the place where her father had seen her. But even that detail is not as clean as it first appears. A missing cigarette pack can indicate intention. It can also indicate routine habit. It can mean she chose to leave the balcony for a minute. It can mean she was still thinking normally. Or it can simply become one more object around which theory gathers without ever becoming proof of anything larger. The deeper problem was that the ship was arriving at Curaçao. A cruise ship at port is not just a location, it is a massive transition point. Passengers prepare to disembark, staff shift routines, announcements and crowd flow change. Doors open in a practical sense and in a psychological one. If Amy was still on board, then time mattered. If she had gone overboard, then time mattered even more. If she had somehow made it off the ship, then every minute that passed before a controlled response widened the field in which she could disappear. This is where the case begins to move from intimate family confusion into the harder world of institutional response. The Bradleys reported Amy missing quickly, but later reporting and family accounts have long emphasized a delay and hesitation in the ship's reaction. The family wanted a more immediate and aggressive response. They wanted announcements. They wanted the gangway controlled. They wanted the ship treated like the scene of an active disappearance before passengers scattered into port. That did not happen in the way they believed it should have. And once a ship in port begins behaving like a normal ship in port, the opportunity to lock the situation down begins to vanish. This is one of the most painful structural elements in the Amy Bradley case. In ocean disappearances, people often imagine the sea as the great destroyer of evidence. But in this case, bureaucracy may have done its own damage first. Delay is not just an emotional theme here, it is investigative loss. If Amy fell overboard, the response window may have narrowed before anyone understood. If Amy remained on the ship, the search may have lost clarity before the environment was controlled. If Amy got off in Curaçao, the chance to stop that from happening may already have been passing, while the family was still trying to convince others that something serious was wrong. A cruise ship is a machine built to keep moving. That is one reason this case feels so cold. The family was living the worst moment of their lives, while the institution around them still had schedules to keep. That does not require malice to feel monstrous. It only requires a system designed to prefer procedure over alarm, until alarm becomes unavoidable. As the morning developed, witnesses and later investigators tried to place Amy in the last narrow corridor of time before she became untraceable. Some reports placed her on an upper deck around dawn. Some linked her to a band member seen earlier that night. Some accounts mentioned that she may have had a camera with her. Others focused on a dark-colored drink in her hand. These details are difficult because they occupy the dangerous zone between useful and seductive. Each one seems like it should unlock the whole case. Each one feels cinematic enough to carry hidden meaning. But none of them, on their own, solve the central problem. they only sharpen it. If Amy was seen after her father last looked out to the balcony, then she left the cabin alive. That matters. If she was seen with another person, that matters too. But the leap from late sighting to proven abduction remains exactly that, a leap. This is one of the weak points in the public understanding of the case. Many people want the final shipboard window to contain a clear villain. The evidence does not fully provide one. It provides unease, opportunity, and unanswered proximity. Those are powerful, but they are not the same as resolution. At the same time, the accident theory has its own weaknesses. People often say that Amy must have gone overboard because there was nowhere else to go. That sounds clean until you sit with it. If she went overboard from the balcony, when and how did that happen? If she climbed or leaned, why? If she was intoxicated enough to fall, why is the timeline around her still so socially active and complex? If she went overboard elsewhere on the ship, what drew her there? None of these questions make an accidental fall impossible. They simply prevent it from being as emotionally tidy as some people want it to be. Amy had a visible presence. She had tattoos. She had a recognizable face. She had a family on board who began pushing immediately for action. She was not a solitary traveler, disappearing without anyone noticing for half a day. For the overboard explanation to satisfy completely, many people feel they must imagine a sudden, silent, unseen fall that left no witness, no clear physical sign, and no later corroboration beyond the absence itself. That is possible. It is not absurd. But the more the case accumulated alleged sightings afterward, the harder it became for the family to accept that the ocean had simply closed over her, and that was all. The first hours after Amy disappeared were therefore lived inside competing realities. The ship and surrounding authorities had to consider the water. The family had to consider the ship, the port, and everyone Amy had crossed paths with in the night. Those are not small differences. They shape everything that follows. If a case begins with a fall, then you search the sea and review the ship as background. If it begins with a possible human encounter, then the ship becomes a contained social landscape in which every bar, corridor, stairwell, staff roll, and blind corner matters. Cruise ships produce a peculiar form of anonymity. They are crowded but isolating. Everyone is near each other, and yet almost no one truly knows who is around them. Guests meet for an hour and never again. Crew move through semi-invisible labor networks that passengers barely understand. Security exists, but passengers often feel it as atmosphere rather than scrutiny. It is exactly the kind of environment in which a person can feel both safe and unobserved. In that sense, the Rhapsody of the Seas was not the opposite of danger. It was a perfect compromise between visibility and confusion. Enough people to assume somebody must have seen something. Enough movement that what someone saw may mean nothing. The sea search that followed Amy's disappearance did not produce her body. That fact is one of the foundations on which all later theory rests. If she had gone overboard, why was nothing found? But water has never promised to answer that question. In a way people can emotionally accept, no body recovered is not the same thing as no death by water. Especially in open sea conditions, the absence of remains is terrible, but it is not extraordinaritives. For us, it tears them apart, it carries them sideways, it swallows minutes and miles at once. The human mind wants recovery because recovery stabilizes time. The sea offers drift instead. Still, the lack of recovery did something more than prolong grief. It opened the door to the second half of the Amy Bradley mystery, the half that transformed the case from a possible maritime death into one of the most debated missing woman cases of the last few decades, because people said they saw her. Not years later, in some vague inland town after the memory had faded. Almost immediately, and then repeatedly, in locations that seemed close enough to the original disappearance to make the idea of survival feel horrible rather than hopeful. One of the earliest reported sightings came from Curaçao itself. A cab driver claimed he had seen a woman matching Amy near the port area on the day the ship arrived. According to later accounts, the woman seemed distressed and was trying to reach a phone. This is the sort of report that can electrify a family and destabilize an investigation. On one hand, it is exactly the kind of clue that might matter if Amy left the ship alive. On the other hand, it remains exactly what it is, an uncorroborated sighting that arrived after the face on the posters had already entered the world. It is not nothing. It is also not enough. Another reported sighting came from 2 Canadian divers who later said they believed they had seen Amy on a beach in Curaçao months after the disappearance. Again, the logic of the case strains under the possibilities. If they truly saw her, then Amy survived the ship, remained somewhere in or around Curaçao, and was still visible long enough for strangers to notice her. But again, there was no verification strong enough to transform that claim into established fact. The Bradley case is full of reports that are emotionally explosive and evidentially unclear. That is one reason it lasts. Every sighting is powerful enough to keep the door open. None is powerful enough to slam it one way or the other. Then came one of the darkest reported encounters in the case. A Navy petty officer later said that, while in Curaçao, he encountered a woman in a brothel who identified herself as Amy Bradley and asked for help. He did not report it immediately. Years passed before the claim entered the family's world. By then, the possible location was gone, and the trail was cold. Of all the alleged sightings, this one became one of the most haunting, because it carried not just recognition, but a direct plea. If true, it would mean Amy had not drowned. It would mean she had survived into a nightmare no one on the ship imagined that morning. But again, the case demands discipline. The account is chilling. It is not verified. The delay in reporting weakens its investigative usefulness. The destruction of the location weakens follow-up. And yet emotionally it is almost impossible to ignore. This is the recurring structure of Amy's case. A claim arrives. It fits one terrible possibility. It cannot be proved. It cannot be fully dismissed. The result is not clarity, but permanent agitation. Years later, photographs of a woman known online as Jazz began circulating, and some believed the woman resembled Amy. This development dragged the case into the era of internet pattern matching, where resemblance can become obsession. The family and many viewers saw similarities. Skeptics saw the ordinary human tendency to find the missing in any familiar face. Once again, the case did what it always does. It offered material that feels loaded with meaning and then refused to confirm whether that feeling corresponds to reality. This is where many stories become irresponsible. They start stacking sightings as if repetition creates certainty. It does not. 3 weak sightings do not become one strong. But something else is true too. Multiple sightings across years can keep alive a possibility that official closure cannot erase. The Amy Bradley case exists in the unresolved territory between those two truths. Enough reports to make the family continue. Not enough evidence to say the reports represent survival rather than projection. That tension feeds directly into the major theories. The first theory is accidental death overboard. It remains the simplest in mechanical terms. Amy spent part of the night drinking. She was last known to be on or near a balcony. The ship was at sea before daybreak. No confirmed evidence places her definitively on shore. An unseen fall, whether by accident or impaired judgment, would explain why she vanished so completely in the immediate timeline. It would also explain why the early focus of authorities remained on the water. This theory explains the absence of a final verified sighting after dawn better than any other. It explains the silence. It explains the immediate impossibility of finding a body. It explains why no confirmed evidence of abduction from the ship was ever produced. It also fits the harsh reality that people do go overboard without witness, and when they do, the ocean often decides the rest. But the theory has real limits. It asks us to accept a fall no one saw, from circumstances no one can reconstruct, during a time when the case also contains witness reports placing Amy elsewhere on the ship after she was last seen by family. It also fails to satisfy people who look at Amy's background and habits and struggle to imagine what would have caused her to end up on the wrong side of a railing. None of that makes it false. It only keeps it from feeling complete. The second theory is foul play on the ship, followed by concealment or forced removal. This theory gains strength from the ambiguous final interactions, the crew's environment, and the family's belief that the ship should have been locked down faster. It also gains force from the simple fact that a cruise ship, for all its lights and movement, is still a place full of partially private spaces, service corridors, crew areas, and temporary encounters. People disappear in crowds when a crowd supplies both cover and indifference. This theory has emotional logic, but it also faces hard, practical questions. If Amy was harmed on the ship, by whom, where, and how was that hidden in such a narrow time frame? If she was removed from the ship alive, through what mechanism did that happen without a single confirmed witness who could later place the event clearly? Ships are not airtight mysteries. They generate records, routines, and notice. A conspiracy large enough to move a passenger off a vessel should have left harder evidence than this case appears to contain. That does not make the theory impossible. It does mean the more elaborate versions of it often outrun the available facts. The third theory is that Amy left the ship alive in Curaçao and was then exploited, abducted, or trafficked on land. This is the theory most energized by the sightings and by the family's long refusal to believe she died in the water. It also fits a darker emotional structure. Amy is not lost. Amy is held. Amy is not unreachable because of nature, but because of people. That possibility has driven much of the public fascination with the case because it turns passive tragedy into active evil, which is easier for many minds to keep searching against. This theory does have some features that make it hard to dismiss outright. The alleged sightings cluster around places and circumstances that point in the same general direction: distress, control by others, Caribbean locations connected to the original disappearance. It is not irrational that the family took them seriously. Yet, as an investigative theory, it still suffers from the same core weakness. No sighting has crossed the line into proof. No physical evidence has been recovered that places Amy on Curaçao or elsewhere after the ship docked. No trafficking case with her at the center has ever been substantiated. The theory survives because it remains possible, not because it has been proven. The final major theory is voluntary disappearance or suicide. This is the weakest and, in many ways, the least persuasive. Amy had plans for work after the trip. She was with family. Nothing in the core public record presents a strong case that she intended to vanish. People sometimes reach for this explanation because it makes the story feel less chaotic. But there is very little in the documented outline that genuinely supports it. It solves almost nothing that the accident theory does not solve better, and it solves none of the disturbing weight of the later sightings except by dismissing them all as error. So where does that leave the case? In the worst place a real investigation can remain, between competing explanations that each possess enough logic to survive and enough weakness to fail. If Amy went overboard, then one of the most haunting maritime disappearances of the era may in fact be a terrible accident surrounded by the kind of noise that accumulates when no body is found and no witness can stop the imagination from moving. If Amy was taken, then one of the most public and crowded environments imaginable still failed to protect her, and then failed to preserve the critical moments that might have saved her. If Amy reached shore alive, then the case is not only unresolved, it is unbearable. One of the reasons this story endures is that cruise ships occupy a very strange place in the modern imagination. They are sold as ease, as escape, as safety wrapped in leisure, a managed version of the sea. But the Bradley case tears that image open. A cruise ship is not a hotel. It is not stable ground. It is a moving environment full of strangers passing through layers of visibility and anonymity at once. The ocean is there every second, even when the ship has convinced you to forget it. Ports come and go, people step off, people step on. Music covers distance, schedules replace intuition. It is exactly the kind of place where a disappearance can become hard to hold on to, because the setting itself is designed to keep drifting toward the next destination. That is why the family's struggle with the ship's response remains so important. Whether Amy fell or was taken, the first hours mattered. Their insistence on immediate action was not panic detached from reality. It was the recognition that once a ship in port behaves normally, normality itself becomes the enemy. The ship can become too big to search decisively, and the island too open to control. A missing person case does not need a cover-up to become unsolvable. It only needs enough delay. The Bradley family did not get the kind of ending people imagined the truth should eventually provide. No recovered remains, no confirmed rescue, no arrest, no verified final image. Instead, they got the thing many families of the missing get: fragments. Witness statements, tips, hope that hurts as much as it helps, and perhaps the cruelest burden of all, a case that keeps renewing itself whenever someone says they might have seen her. There is another reason the case remains so difficult to settle. Unlike disappearances in isolated wilderness, this one took place across overlapping jurisdictions and moving boundaries. A cruise ship in international waters is one environment. A cruise ship approaching a foreign port is another. The moment a passenger vanishes near arrival, responsibility begins to blur. Ship security, local authorities, Coast Guard resources, port access, passenger movement, crew accountability. Every one of those systems may do something. None of them can restore the lost simplicity of the first hour. In Amy's case, that matters because the first hour may have been the only hour in which one clear line of action could have dominated everything else. Had the ship been sealed immediately, one version of the case might have hardened. If Amy was still aboard, a systematic search might have clarified that quickly. If she was not, the absence itself would have taken on a different weight. Had the port been treated as an emergency perimeter before normal disembarkation patterns took over, another version might have hardened. Witnesses could have been identified faster. Timelines could have been sharpened before memory began dissolving into retelling. But that is not what happened. The case entered the public record already damaged by uncertainty. This is why the Bradley family's frustration never sounds like ordinary hindsight blame. It sounds like people who understood, in real time, that each minute of hesitation widened the map. Missing person cases often become impossible, not because there were no clues, but because clues were allowed to drift away from their moment of maximum value. Amy's disappearance may be one of the clearest examples of that principle. Once the ship kept moving, and the island kept receiving passengers, the case stopped being one scene and became several at once. The ship itself is worth lingering on because cruise environments produce an illusion of observation. There are always people around, and people naturally translate that into security. But crowds do not always protect. Sometimes they erase. The more movement there is, the easier it becomes for any one movement to look unimportant. A woman in a hallway does not mean anything. A woman on a stairwell does not mean anything. A woman going toward a deck does not mean anything. A woman speaking to a crew member does not mean anything. All of those tiny, unremarkable moments remain invisible until one person fails to return. Then the entire environment retroactively becomes dense with significance, but by then the significance has already detached from its moment. That is one reason the Amy Bradley case has always felt different from other cruise disappearances. It is not just that she vanished from a ship. It is that the ship was so socially alive when she did. Music had not long faded. People were still cycling between nightlife and sleep. Staff were transitioning from entertainment hours to arrival hours. The vessel was about to dock. Dawn was rising over a port. The setting is saturated with human activity, which makes the disappearance feel less like a person slipping out of the world and more like a person slipping between pieces of it. If Amy went overboard, then she may have crossed from one environment into another in seconds. From conversation and railings and deck lights into darkness and wake. From a managed world into a natural one that does not pause because a human story has just become desperate. That transition, if it happened, is one of the hardest things for people to imagine, honestly. Falling from a ship is not simply hitting water and swimming. It is impact, disorientation, noise, distance, current, and the terrible speed with which a vessel keeps becoming smaller. Even a strong swimmer can be turned into an invisible point almost immediately. That is one of the reasons the overboard theory survives. It does not need the ocean to be dramatic. It only needs the ocean to keep behaving like the ocean. Yet if that happened, then the later sightings are all false. Not malicious, necessarily. Not all invented. Just wrong. Wrong in the way frightened families and uncertain witnesses sometimes become wrong when the mind refuses to close around randomness. That possibility is emotionally brutal, because it would mean hope itself became one more injury. The family would have spent years chasing signals generated by grief colliding with coincidence. And if the sightings were not all wrong, then the case becomes darker in the opposite direction. Then the morning on the ship was not the end of Amy's physical struggle, but the beginning of a second life lived inside fear and control. People are drawn to this possibility because it preserves agency where the sea removes it. The missing person is still in the world. She can be found. She can be rescued. The story remains active, but it also introduces a terrible moral burden. If Amy survived, then the world did not merely fail to save her at dawn. It failed repeatedly afterward. This burden shaped the Bradley family's life for years. Families of the missing are forced into a strange profession they never chose. They become archivists of maybe. They store witness statements that may matter and may not. They learn to evaluate tips from strangers while protecting themselves from obvious fraud and from hope that sounds persuasive. They begin living on two tracks at once. One track follows evidence. The other follows endurance. The first asks what can be proved. The second asks how long a human being can continue searching when proof refuses to arrive. Amy's family did what many determined families do. They kept moving. They pursued leads. They returned to the Caribbean. They spoke publicly. They tried to hold the case in national attention. This persistence is sometimes misread by outsiders as refusal to accept reality that is too simple. Persistence in a case like this is not denial. It is the rational response to an unresolved file containing just enough uncertainty to keep one door open. If authorities cannot prove death and cannot prove survival, then families are left standing in the doorway between them. The problem is that unresolved cases attract predators of a different kind. Not only the person who may have harmed the missing person, if such a person exists, but the opportunists who gather around the wound afterward. False witnesses, attention seekers, grifters, people who sense that a family will pay emotionally, and sometimes financially, for anything that sounds like progress. Amy's case became notorious not only for its mystery, but for the way it exposed how unsolved disappearances create their own secondary crimes. The family was approached over the years by people who claimed access, knowledge, rescue possibilities, secret locations. Some of those claims were fantasies. Some were likely manipulations. One especially cruel episode involved a man who convinced the family he had intelligence that could lead to Amy and then extracted a significant amount of money before the story collapsed as a scam. That detail matters because it reveals the true afterlife of unresolved cases. They do not simply remain unsolved in some abstract legal sense. They become environments in which uncertainty itself can be exploited. Every false lead steals not only money or time, but shape. It warps the emotional contour of the case. It adds noise. It makes future real information harder to distinguish from performance. By the time years pass, the family is no longer searching for a daughter inside a clean field of evidence. They are searching inside a landscape of contamination. This is one reason the Amy Bradley case often feels more frightening the longer you sit with it. Not because the theories become wilder, but because the whole ecosystem around the disappearance becomes visible. Cruise line procedure, maritime search limits, island rumor, witness memory, media appetite, internet resemblance, culture, scam artists, law enforcement boundaries, family persistence, hope turning into a market. It is not just one mystery. It is a demonstration of what happens when a disappearance occurs in a setting too fluid for a single authority to hold and too evocative for the public to leave alone. The media played its part in this transformation. A young woman vanishing from a Caribbean cruise ship is almost tailor-made for television. It contains luxury and danger in the same frame. It offers a visually simple question. How can someone disappear from a place like that? But media attention cuts in two directions. It keeps the case visible, which families often need. It also encourages dramatic packaging. Certain details get repeated because they are vivid, not because they are most probative. The band member becomes more central. The sighting in the brothel becomes more central. The photographs become more central. Meanwhile, the quieter structural facts, uncertainty in timing, delayed response, the ordinary limits of maritime search, can get pushed to the side because they are less cinematic, even if they are more important. For a serious documentary, this means the challenge is not to intensify the case. The case is already intense enough. The challenge is to strip away anything that merely sounds sinister and hold on to what actually changes the shape of the disappearance. Did the family report her missing quickly? Yes. Did the ship respond in a way that has remained controversial? Yes. Did the sea search fail to recover her? Yes. Were there later reports of sightings? Yes. Were those sightings ever verified strongly enough to establish survival? No. Everything honest about the case begins there. One overlooked aspect of Amy's disappearance is the psychological effect of the port itself. Curaçao was not the open ocean. It was not a point of total isolation. That matters because it feeds the intuition that she might have made it to land or been taken to land. If the ship had been days from port, the public might have settled more firmly into the overboard theory. But proximity changes imagination. Nearness to shore introduces roads, buildings, people, phones, exits, criminal networks, and chance witnesses. In other words, it multiplies human possibilities. That multiplication is why the family never stopped seeing Curaçao not just as a destination on the itinerary, but as the place where the case may have transformed from disappearance into something else. At the same time, proximity to shore can also deceive. People hear near port and unconsciously translate it into rescue. But ships do not move through a shoreline in the way a car moves past a gas station. Near port can still mean dark water, distance, current, blind angles, and a person who, if in the sea, is not near anything that could save them. This is one of the hardest facts in the case. Curaçao makes land feel close enough to matter, and the ocean makes that closeness almost meaningless. The mind wants one of those truths to defeat the other. Instead, they exist together. There is also the problem of memory drift. Every famous disappearance acquires versions of itself. The original file is one thing. Public memory is another. Over years, details harden or soften, depending on how often they are repeated. Some become sharper than the evidence allows. Others get lost because they are not dramatic enough to survive retelling. In Amy's case, people often remember the broad beats, but not the uncertainty attaching to them. They remember the balcony, the band, the sightings, the brothel claim, the photographs. But they forget how much of the case lives in conditional language. Reportedly, believed, claimed, possibly, not independently confirmed. For an audience hungry for answers, those words feel frustrating. For an honest investigation, they are essential. This is why the Bradley case produces such strong debate in comment sections and forums. It lets viewers choose what kind of uncertainty they are most willing to live with. Some people prefer the accident theory because it closes the social universe of the ship and restores a kind of tragic order. Others prefer the abduction theory because it preserves the disturbing witness accounts and makes sense of why the family refused to let the case settle. Neither side is simply irrational. Each is responding to a different emotional center in the evidence. The accident side trusts mechanics, the ship, the balcony, the sea, the absence of proof for anything more elaborate. The abduction side trusts pattern, human contact, delayed response, repeated sightings, the possibility that a crowded environment can hide exploitation better than people want to believe. The problem is that the case never forces these instincts to collide in a way that produces final resolution. It only keeps both alive. Another reason the case remains so powerful is that Amy does not vanish into pure mystery immediately. She remains culturally present. Her face is clear. Her age is fixed in the public mind. Her family is vocal and recognizably human. This prevents the case from becoming abstract. It is not a legend attached to a place. It is a missing daughter whose story continued to evolve in public. Each new report, whether meaningful or not, attached itself to a face people had already learned. That continuity turns ordinary time into something more agonizing. Amy did not disappear into the 19th century or into an old newspaper clipping few remember. She disappeared into the era of television, internet, circulation, and endless replay. And yet, all of that visibility has not solved anything. This is perhaps the most unsettling modern feature of the case. In older disappearances, we sometimes blame the period. Poor communication, fewer records, limited forensic reach. Amy vanished in a world that already knew how to document people, how to circulate alerts, how to review timelines, how to broadcast faces. Not at today's level, but far beyond the conditions of many historic mysteries. And still the case resisted. That resistance tells us something important. Technology and visibility do not eliminate the oldest problem in missing person investigations. They only make the absence feel more offensive, more modern, less forgivable. There is another layer to this story that often gets lost beneath the mystery. Amy did not vanish as a symbol. She vanished as a daughter and sister in the middle of shared time. That matters because long unsolved cases often flatten the missing person into a silhouette. The cruise ship woman, the girl on the poster, the face from the documentary. But to the people closest to her, Amy remains located in a very different place. Not in theory, in memory. In a family cabin, on a balcony chair, in the short distance between one waking and the next. That is what makes the case so emotionally hard to bear. The gap is not grand, it is small. A father looked out and saw what he believed was his daughter sleeping. Less than an hour later, the future had split open. Most devastating mysteries do not begin with spectacle. They begin with tiny distances, misjudged in ordinary time, and still the case refuses to resolve. If you believe the water took Amy, then you are left with one of the bleakest versions of random loss imaginable. A family vacation ending in a silent fall into dawn, followed by an ocean search that found nothing and a lifetime of speculation built on the absence. If you believe she left the ship alive, then the case becomes a kind of moving prison. A woman vanishing not into nature, but into a network of human possibility, so wide it became impossible to search in full. Either way, the family lost her in a place built around movement, a ship moving toward shore, passengers moving toward daylight, years moving away from certainty. That movement is the permanent atmosphere of the case. Even now, Amy Bradley is suspended inside motion, between ship and island, between sea and land, between sea and land, between accident and crime, between witness and rumor, between hope and grief. There are disappearance cases in which the central question becomes narrower with time. People eliminate possibilities. Evidence hardens. A likely answer emerges. Amy Bradley's case did the opposite. Time widened it. The farther the original moment receded, the more versions of her fate the world created. that is not the same thing as the truth becoming richer. Often it only means the truth became harder to touch. So what are we left with after all these years? A young woman last known to be on a family cruise. A dawn window no one can fully reconstruct. A shipboard response the family has never stopped questioning. An ocean that gave nothing back. Reported sightings that are too disturbing to ignore and too weak to settle the matter. A family that kept choosing the harder path, continuing to search in a case where searching means living with uncertainty as a permanent condition. And one enduring question that has never gone away. How does a person disappear from a cruise ship without leaving behind a single answer strong enough to end the argument? That is the cold center of the Amy Bradley mystery. Not just where she went, but what kind of world allows a case like this to remain open in human imagination for so long. A world where a floating resort can become a crime scene or an accident site, and then become neither with certainty. A world where the sea erases and rumor replaces. A world where a daughter can vanish within yards of her family and still remain, decades later, suspended between incompatible endings. Maybe Amy Lynn Bradley fell into the water before sunrise, and the simplest explanation, however brutal, is the correct one. Maybe someone on that ship saw vulnerability in the half-light and acted before the world was fully awake. Maybe the island received her alive for a few terrible hours, or months, or years, and the sightings are not noise at all, but echoes of a life stolen sideways. Every version of the story asks us to imagine a different final chapter. None can prove itself beyond the rest. That is why the case still matters. Because unresolved disappearances are not only about the missing, they are about the limits of systems that promise safety and the limits of evidence in moving environments. They are about how quickly a person can pass beyond the edge of what institutions can recover. And they are about what families are forced to do when the world offers them possibilities instead of truth. Amy Bradley never got to come home and explain where the morning went. Her family never got the final certainty that grief depends on. The public never got a single theory strong enough to silence all the others. What remains is the image, the balcony, the dark water below, the ship nearing shore, the possibility that she was closer to rescue than anyone knew, the possibility that she was already beyond it. And perhaps that is why this case has never loosened its hold on people, because it happened in a place designed to feel safe. Because the final window is short enough to replay forever, because every explanation leaves something unresolved, and because somewhere between sea and shore, Amy Lynn Bradley disappeared into one of the most enduring questions a modern missing persons case has ever produced. If you have your own theory about what happened to Amy, tell me in the comments. And if you want more real disappearances, dark documentary investigations, and unresolved cases explored with evidence first,